All right. Thank you. Thanks, Meg. So as Meg said, my name is Michael Brown. I am an assistant professor of student affairs and higher education at Iowa State University in the School of Education, which is in the College of Human Sciences. And so what I'm going to talk about today is an ongoing research project that I've been engaged in for the last couple of years, trying to understand what students are doing with technology as it relates to their coursework in these large undergraduate lectures, right? As a researcher, I'm particularly interested in these the kind of large, 60, 100 plus student undergraduate lecture that are the pathways to academic majors, because those are generally the gatekeeping courses where students first experience academic difficulty, they first experience the rigor and all of the challenge involved in undergraduate education, and a lot of them get, there's what's called a cooling out process, right? They get deterred from their aspirations by the coursework or by the way that the course is structured and the experiences that they have in the classroom. So what we're going to talk about today, there's sort of four parts. The first is I'm going to broadly situate what I mean by undergraduate students in digital tools, because digital tools encompasses a lot of different things. And it can pretty much encompass anything that you do in your day-to-day social life now, right? Everything kind of has an extension of a digital tool that's attached to it. And then I'm going to talk about some of the themes that are emerging in this research project that I'm doing around students' novel use of study technology and their transformation of digital tools into study technology. And then we're going to kind of pull back a little bit from student-specific behaviors and talk broadly about where faculty fit into these use and behavior patterns that I'm observing with students and what faculty can do to potentially shape those behaviors in ways that accord more closely with how they're designing their courses. And then we're going to do an activity for the second half about unknown unknowns, and it'll be fun and interactive, and I'll explain that a little bit more when we get there. But so as I said, what I was initially looking at was the way that these courses are organized. What kind of structures do faculty members put into place that, am I walking right by the pole? This camera, I'm worried, so I will make multiple references to it. I apologize in advance. But what faculty were doing in their classrooms to create organizational arrangements that either push students towards certain activities or deter students from other behaviors. And in particular, what I was interested in was when we design a curriculum, how faculty members or instructors, whether they're faculty members or not, in their idiosyncratic development of course materials, create local conditions that result in different forms of engagement among students. So the common example of that is we've got three people who are all teaching the same introductory physics class, but they're all teaching it in slightly different ways, and those slight variations result in substantially different ways with which the students engage in the course. So in this study, there were three instructors. Two were teaching in a flipped classroom model where students would watch a video and then come into the classroom and do problems and activities in the classroom. The other instructor was using a traditional information delivery model. And so what that meant was that the students when students were spending their time outside of the classroom, they were spending their time in substantially different ways. And so I was particularly interested in how students form study groups around this class. Well, if you've got to spend, about 10 to 15 hours a week watching videos, you're probably not going to be working with someone who doesn't have to do that, right? The development of these instructional activities sort of push students together in different arrangements, but the arrangements that result are not necessarily ideal for student learning, right? Students don't gravitate towards the person they feel the most affinity with. They gravitate to the person that most efficiently can do the work with. And what came out of that study was that students were using technology to try to overcome some of these organizational arrangements, right? They were trying to use technology to produce more efficient ways to study together. And when I said that to the instructors, they were like, oh, that's fascinating. We have no idea what they're doing outside of the classroom. Like, we have a broad sense of what we would like them to be doing, but we don't really know. And I thought, oh, someone should study that. So I did. So I went into this. There's only a little bit of research that looks at really what students are doing on a day-to-day basis with technology in undergraduate campus life. And generally, what researchers found was that students' use of this technology reflects the preferences of their instructors, so how they're instructed to use it. And it also reflects institutional infrastructure. So if the technology isn't widely adopted across the institution, students are very unlikely to use it on a regular basis. So if you think about the difference between Canvas on this campus and at my campus, where it's used in every classroom, and students become relatively proficient in using Canvas in a lot of different ways because they're constantly exposed to the different affordances of it, versus at Iowa State, we have this tool called Top Hat, which is a bring your own device kind of clicker tool, and the instructor can make questions and you use your device and you answer the questions without having to buy a clicker. The problem with Top Hat is it's only used in a couple of classes. And so when I talk to students about their use of it, they're really frustrated with it because they don't get a lot of time in the tool to understand how it works. And they feel like they're spending half of their time figuring out how to input the answer, and then the other half of the time actually answering a question. That's not an ideal learning activity, right? The other thing that happens is that when we put these digital resources into different arrangements, they create complications for students' lives. So if you put everything on Canvas, I have to be able to access Canvas. Part of the way that I designed the study was I wanted to look at different institutional types where students had access to different technology resources. In particular, I intentionally included a commuter campus because I wanted to see if students aren't on campus 24/7 and they don't have access to broadband or Wi-Fi, does that change the way that they use technology in their study behavior? But really, this came from an argument that I see a lot in educational technology, which is that when we do these studies, we focus on the state of the art. We want to understand, like, this is the new cool teaching tool. How does it work in terms of implementation? And then how does it work in terms of impact on student outcomes? And then we never return to that technology again because we've documented that it works and we've documented how you need to use it to make it work. But we don't really have an understanding of how, once it becomes part of the invisible infrastructure of a class, what consequences there are from using that technology and what perhaps unintended opportunities came out of that. So what I really wanted to do in this study was provide instructors with a state of the actual about what their students are doing on campus and outside of the classroom in particular. So what this study really focuses on is this idea of out-of-class study behavior, which is largely self-determined. In the classroom, we can create all of these structures that students are required to complete during class time. We incentivize them through points or through credit. Out of class, we tend not to have as much control over what students are doing, or at least we have fewer opportunities to influence their behavior. And so because students respond to different kinds of incentives that are organized around the class in different ways, that limits our ability to predict the kinds of things that we do in the classroom, right? Like provide performance feedback. There's lots of documented evidence that suggests that relative to a student's goals for the course, they're going to respond to performance feedback very differently. Or using external contingencies like points, credits, assignments, projects. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is this idea of using social expectations. So what I found in my own research is that when students work with peers, it creates a sense of relatedness, a sense of belonging, and it tends to keep them on task. Because if I know that I have to show up and be prepared to work with Naomi, and Naomi is also my friend, and I don't want to disappoint Naomi, I'm going to show up prepared to work most of the time. Because I'm not just relying on Naomi as a source of academic support, but Naomi and I might also be providing each other social and emotional support. So what we see happening is that out-of-class study behavior is largely driven by these things like inherent interest in the topic, students' individual preferences, and their perceived cost of academic tasks. And this is particularly true in STEM courses, right? Those classes are not necessarily inherently interesting to someone who wants to be an engineer, but they are very important for their future attainment goals, right? And they're very important for their ability to sort of move through the institution the way that they want to. And so the perceived cost of these tasks becomes higher. They might be willing to spend more time and energy on doing academic work. And so what we see in a lot of curriculum design is that instructors rely on these external contingencies, right, to encourage students to do things. But what really seems to make the biggest difference when we want to keep students on task and encourage them to engage in different kinds of academic tasks is to figure out ways to develop curriculum and course material that intrinsically motivate students. And so this means really focusing on three things: students' perception of their own competence, providing them opportunities for autonomy in the curriculum, and fostering a sense of relatedness, right? Most large lecture classes are really good at giving students opportunities to evaluate their own competence. We give students practice problem exams. We tell them to do homework in the book. It helps them evaluate how well they understand the material. What I don't see a lot of examples of in the STEM courses that I'm researching is any chance to engage in relatedness with each other. But what I've found is that when students do have those opportunities, their study behaviors change in really positive ways that we wouldn't otherwise notice, right? So working with other people exposes you to alternative study strategies that you generally don't have access to and that you wouldn't get feedback from the instructor about because you're in a class of 600 students, right? So in terms of research design, basically there's two components to this study. I pick a couple of focal classes, and I sit in those classes basically every day. I feel like I should have an undergraduate degree in physics and biology at this point, but I've never taken beyond the 100 level, so that's probably not true. And I did this at 3 institutions of 2 different types. So 2 of the institutions were residential, where the undergraduates, at least in the first 2 years, largely lived on campus. They were deeply connected to campus resources. And then the other institution was a commuter institution. All of these students were in the first year, but the commuter institution, the students, first of all, didn't live on campus, and then they tended to be older than what we think of as the average typical age of an undergraduate, right? The average age at that institution, I believe, was 27. Quite a few of the students that I interviewed had children or had other family responsibilities and obligations outside of work. And so technology became important and salient for them in a way that it wasn't necessarily for the students at the residential institution because, for example, it's harder for them to come back to campus to take a supplemental instruction class, right? It's harder for them to find a group of students to study with because they can't walk down the residence hall floor and say, you, and you, we have an exam tomorrow. Let's take over the lounge and get out our textbooks. So they have to be much more intentional and purposeful in a lot of ways about how they're using technology. And so when I say digital study technology, I'm referring to a broad spectrum of tools. Basically, if it's web-enabled and students use it as part of their academic coursework, I considered it a digital study technology. And so when I was interviewing students, the question that I posed was, like, what things do you use to prepare for class? And things could have been anything. You know, the follow-up questions were all about the technologies that they were using. So as you'll see, a search engine is effectively a digital study technology for a lot of these students. It's not something that the instructor has any control or ability to author or direct, but it does become a regular part of their study practices. So the first thing that emerged for me when I was talking to these students was that when you put a new platform in front of them, they have to learn how to use it. And in the process of learning how to use it, they're going to do a couple of different things. They're going to play with the tool and see what the affordances are. And when I say play, I mean they're literally going to get creative about what they can do with the tool and what kind of information they're going to put into it. They're going to test the boundaries of what's appropriate with the technology. And then eventually, in this feedback loop between the instructor and the student, they're going to get to a place where they figure out how do you communicate clear objectives through the tool so that students know how to use it and use it for its intended purpose. So the first thing that I saw a lot of was when you put a new tool in the room or expose students to a new tool, they play with the affordances. So this was an example of in a classroom where they were using a bring your own device technology. The instructor asked students to create a diagram about how electrons move through space. This is Mr. Electron. He became very popular by the end of this semester because he showed up in every diagram. But the students they knew there were no points attached to this. They knew there was no assessment attached to it. So they had fun with it. And they started to look forward to actually using this technology. The idea that they could do some creative expression in the tool and still meet the objectives of the learning activity really appealed to them. And they actually got a little bit frustrated because this was used in a 100 level course, and then when they took the 200 level course, they didn't use the technology anymore, and they missed it. They missed the opportunity to interact in the classroom and with the instructor in this way. But this wasn't just something that I saw with bring your own devices. Anytime they encounter a new tool, they want to blow out the affordances, right? They want to figure out what every feature is, they're going to evaluate them, and then they're going to adopt the things that make the most sense for them and have the most utility given their objectives in the class. So, you'll see in a little bit, a lot of these students discover Yahoo Answers in the process of taking a 100-level lecture course. And so they become very I think they're the only people that are keeping Yahoo Answers alive at this point. But they become very active users of the tool, and they start asking other questions on it because they're trying to figure out how big of a community is on there, what kind of resources and help are available. So the other thing that they do is they test the boundaries. When you give students a learning activity, they're expecting that it should have points or assessment attached to it. If it doesn't have that, then there's always the student who's going to answer Wu-Tang, right, regardless of the question, because they know that it doesn't, they're thinking in terms of how does this impact my grade? If it doesn't impact my grade, I tend not to care about it too much. And so what you see, though, is there's a lot of testing boundaries here, right? It's not just the Wu-Tang student. There's a student who just doesn't know the answer, so they put try harder, right? And there's this little, is that an emoji? Is that what an emoji? That's not an emoji. Yeah, that. People think because I study technology, I know anything about computers, and that's not true. But learn Python, right, which is a pretty pithy response to how would you test air resistance in this problem, right? And so students are doing this, and when the instructor gives them feedback about what is and isn't an appropriate answer, they start to change their behavior over time, right? But because they perceive these large lecture courses to be relatively anonymous, they want to see what they can get away with a little bit, and they want to see how technology might facilitate their interactions with the instructor. It's also a way, I think, in these large impersonal classrooms to potentially get some attention from the instructor. If the instructor calls out, right, your response, you maybe feel seen. You know, I did actually interview the Wu-Tang student, and she was not particularly happy that the instructor called out her response. She thought, you know, there's only 36 responses. There are 250 students in this class. So she thought she was just going to disappear into the fabric of these responses. But eventually what happens is the instructor learns how to use the tool in an effective way, gives students a clear objective through the tool, and the students realize the utility of the tool. The real value of this tool was that they could put a complex formula like this into the response and immediately get feedback from the system about whether it was correct or not, make a change, and the system would tell them if they had improved, right? They didn't know that that was something the system they could do until they had tested the boundaries, played with it, figured out what kind of feedback was there, and the instructor had figured out how to use the technology in a way that provided clear objectives to students, right? So the other thing that was kind of clear across the board was that when students leave the classroom and they're studying on their own, they're almost always looking for clarity on concepts that they don't understand. And I would say it's this generation of students, but I am much older than them, and I do the same thing, right? When I don't understand something or I want to know the answer to a question, the first thing I do is go to the internet. And this was, I could have probably pulled out 40 different quotes where students said the same thing, right? They know that there is a lot of information available on the web to them. They know that looking for that information is relatively a straightforward process, and it's a process they understand. And the advantage of the internet is that it's always on, right? Supplemental instruction happens once a week for 3 hours. If you have to work during those 3 hours or you miss the sign up, you can't participate in supplemental instruction anymore. If you're a commuter and it takes you 45 minutes to come back to campus to go to office hours are not accessible to you in most cases. But the internet's always on. And so what I noticed across these STEM classes is that when students are doing the online homework system and it's 10 o'clock at night and the homework's due at midnight, they will literally copy and paste the question and go to Yahoo Answers. And I thought I was going to have to do like some eliciting to get that fact from students, but they don't see this as cheating, right? They don't see this as something that they should be a little bit circumspect about. This is part of their practices, and they don't have any qualms about doing it. Now, the flip side of that is that there's research that suggests that when you do this once, it increases the likelihood that you will do it over and over again, and doing it over and over again will cost you grade points over time, right? Students who, this is from a study that they did at MIT where they were looking at mastering physics use over time, and they found that the more that students copied answers, right, within an assignment cycle, first of all, the more likely that they would continue to do it as time went on, but also the more likely that they would suffer their grade would continue to decline as the course went on. And so students, this had never occurred to students, right? When I talk to them, they see homework as a different academic activity from preparing for an exam, right? They generally didn't make the question that, like, I'm doing homework they didn't make the connection that I'm doing homework to prepare for and understand and reinforce the concepts that I'm doing in this class. to prepare for the exam. And a lot of these students that I talk to think about exams in very different ways than maybe students a generation ago would, because they're coming out of schools where exams and high-stakes testing are part of a regime, and it's part of evaluation that's sort of above and beyond you. You know, there were a lot of students I talked to who described high school classes where they spent a year preparing for a state standards exam, right? An exam has a very different function for these students. And what they were doing to prepare for that exam was very rarely integrated with the other stuff that they were doing in their K through 12 curriculums, right? There was exam prep time, and then there was class time. And those two things in a lot of cases weren't integrated for them, probably in a way that if we sat in that classroom, we would feel like they were integrated, like there was a clear connection, but students tended to think of these things as distinct. So what happens is that the internet doesn't make differentiation between good and bad advice. And mostly what happens is that when students go into the web looking for clarity, they get very specific answers because they're looking for a very specific thing. They're looking for a solution and not an explanation. And that creates a problem. So I teach physics. In physics, we talk about this idea in teaching of moving from particular examples to general explanations and then reinforcing the general explanation with a particular example. And what I found is when my students don't understand something, whether it's in statistical computing or whether it's in the actual statistical concepts, is they go to the internet, and the internet reinforces their learning as a particular example, a particular example, a particular example. There are very few good, general, broad explanations available on the internet. And students are not experts in these topics yet, right? So they're not good at evaluating the quality of an answer beyond whatever sort of existing information literacy that they have. So they end up looking for a solution instead of an explanation. And what happens in this process is that they become trained to look for specificity in an answer as an indicator of quality, which it isn't necessarily the case. And then the other thing that happens is they go onto the internet with the intention to understand what they don't understand. And what happens is they get the right answer, but they don't necessarily start to develop a conceptual understanding of the material. And then there's websites like Chegg where you can literally go and pay and have all of the answers for the textbook for the semester. That, to them, is cheating, right? They don't pay for Chegg, but they go to Yahoo Answers to get the correct answer. I still don't get the sort of conceptual distinction, but for them, that's where the boundaries are. Chegg is academic dishonesty. Yahoo Answers is a learning resource. And so there's these unclear boundaries between cheating and help-seeking. The other thing that students mentioned quite a bit was this idea that they have to, they're exposed to so many materials and resources at the beginning of a class that they don't really have the opportunity to learn about the technology when they need it, right? So in one of the physics courses, they used a tool that's very similar to Problem Roulette, if you're familiar with Problem Roulette, right? It was an online practice problem application tool. And I was interviewing these students while they were in a second physics course. They had that technology introduced to them in their physics course, but then it was never mentioned again. And when it was initially mentioned, they weren't thinking they were going to have problems with academic difficulty. They thought, I've been an A student in every science class I've ever taken, and so I'm going to do great in this class. And they didn't pay a lot of close attention in those first couple of days to what I could use to help me do better in this class, because they were focused on what I need to do to get the grade that I want in this class. So what assignments do I have to do? What kind of grades do I have to get on certain exams to be able to achieve the metrics that I need to move forward in my major? And when they did encounter academic difficulty, they didn't know where to go, right? And so in some cases, the residential students were able to go to resources on campus. Commuter students had a harder time, right? And so one of the things that instructors might think about is when they revisit introducing these help-seeking resources to students, right? Is it something that you only do around exams? Because students are focused on so many things during an exam, in particular the content that's going to be on the exam, that they may not be giving equal attention to the resources that they could be using that would help them learn those concepts. So the last thing that I noticed, and this is where the will they break it comes from, was that students, a lot of this technology is not built to be social, especially study technology, right? Top Hat doesn't have any thing built in it where you could share answers with a peer and have them look at it. The problem roulette, for example, a couple of years ago when I was doing a study with that, had no opportunity for you to share your results with anyone. If you had a question about something, you had to take a screenshot of it and bring it into office hours, right? But students use these technologies in social ways, right? So they would sit down with a bunch of, this practice problem application, throw it up on the web, and work together collaboratively to do the problems. And when they did that, first of all, they tended to do better in the class, right? The students who were able to create these study groups generally did better in the course. I'm not sure if that's that they were better students and so they knew to create the study groups, or the study groups had some kind of differential impact. I'm sure it's a tangled web of those things. But when students were able to use the technology as part of their social and academic lives, they generally felt like they got more utility out of it. They felt more positive about it. They could also more clearly connect it to the learning that they were doing in the classroom. So what does this mean when we're thinking about self-determination outside of the classroom? Well, a lot of these technologies do a good job of just addressing one domain of self-determination, right? Bring your own devices provides students a lot of autonomy, so does searching the web. They can do it whenever they want. But it doesn't help necessarily reinforce competence. Practice problem web applications allowed students to evaluate their competence, but it didn't sort of naturally give them a lot of autonomy in how they move through the material because of the way that the tool was designed. And the searching for the web and for study resources, when I asked students if using that, how using that impacted their learning, they said that they learned from it, right? They identified that it was improving their conceptual understanding of these problems, but I would argue that probably it's increasing their perceived competence, right? That what's happening is they're getting all of this performance feedback from the system that's telling them, you got 100% on your homework, and your predicted grade for this class is this. But that homework is no longer an effective evaluator of their learning of the material, right? And I think in general, we're probably overlooking the value of creating opportunities for students to integrate their social and academic worlds using technology. So what happens here is that students are plugged into their individual ecosystems. And when I say ecosystems, I don't just mean tech ecosystems, right? But they're social worlds. And so for commuter students, there weren't the same opportunities to engage in the kind of in-person social interaction. And so technology has a lot of affordances for providing them the opportunity to interact socially around their academic work. There were a lot of students that would use messaging services that were web-based, and the names of all of them are escaping me now. But they would literally take a picture of a problem and text it to a friend and ask them what they didn't understand, right? They were creating these ad hoc, asynchronous study groups through the use of study technology. Students also really, really like always-on resources. Their lives are, sort of structured around 24/7 resources. They're used to being able to plug into anything whenever they want. What was interesting is that the textbook is an always-on resource. You always have access to it, and it's always there, but they very rarely trusted it or used it as a reliable resource to explain concepts. And then the last piece was thinking about what and when students need to know about resources. So in the classes that I observed, faculty members tended to front load these resources that they were introducing. And they would periodically revisit them in the lead up to a course or in the lead up to an exam or right after an exam, right after students had gotten some kind of performance feedback. But they tended not to stress them in those cases, right? And it may be that there are some resources that are just really useful later on in the course or really useful after you've moved through a certain kind of material or certain objectives, and that students can better assess the utility and the value of those things. But what I saw happen here, and what I want to kind of continue to explore, and I encourage you all to think about in your courses, is this idea that socio-technical systems that we create through our use of technology have the opportunity to have the potential to produce opportunities for socio-academic integration, right? And we, as a learning researcher, what I really want is for students to have the opportunity to take their social world and mesh it with their academic world on campus. Because when they do that, they do better. They're more likely to persist and be retained. they're more likely to achieve their goals in a course, they're more likely to achieve their goals in a major program, they're more likely to evaluate the campus environment as positive because they have people and resources in the campus environment that span their social and academic worlds. And so thinking about the ways that we can structure and encourage students to use these technologies that produce those opportunities for integration, I think is really important. So I've talked a lot about students. Where does that kind of leave faculty in this conversation? I have some ideas. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. But one of the anxieties that I hear a lot from instructors when we start to study educational technology in their classrooms is that when you move to a student-centered instructional model, they worry that the instructor then becomes decentered, right? That if students are centered, the instructor by definition can't be centered in the instruction. So if I'm spending all my time using technology to have students work on academic tasks, then what's my role in the classroom at that point? Do I even need to be in the classroom? Like, where's my expertise showing up? So I think there's a couple of things that we can keep in mind when we're imagining how we might reorganize or organize teaching and learning in our classrooms. One is to focus on goal and problem formation in the development of instructional tools and in the framing of those tools for students. So a lot of technology like Top Hat, for example, when instructors were using these bring your own device tools, they don't start out with a clear idea of what problem that tool is supposed to address other than efficiency. It's more efficient than an iClicker because students don't have to go to the bookstore and buy an iClicker, and it saves students money. But efficiency isn't necessarily a good learning outcome, right? Or a good learning objective. It's not a good motivator for designing an instructional task. Once instructors use these technologies for a little while, they start to understand what the affordances are of the tool, and they build that tool to address learning activities in a more efficient way. We saw that with that example where we moved from Mr. Neutron, right, to using the tool to assess students' ability to construct a formula that addresses motion. So thinking explicitly about what's the goal of the tool and also how are we forming the problem within these tools that we want students to address, I think is particularly important. I think, too, sometimes faculty are aware of other ways that these tools have value for students, but they don't necessarily communicate that to students. So, in a lot of these classes, the instructors would tell students, study together, or like use a messaging app to coordinate your study together. But they don't explain to students that actually studying with other people has a whole other host of benefits that they'd be able to access, right? It increases your social network on campus. It provides you other people that you can work with in other classes, right? It provides you people that just have instrumental knowledge about the classroom. There were quite a few students that I interviewed that were like, well, I worked independently in the first class, and then in the second class, I found a study group. And what I realized was that the study group is actually the most important for the days that I missed, right? Students that have, there was a student I was interviewing that had a chronic illness and just missed a lot of the first course. And having a study group helped her deal with some of the anxiety that came from missing courses because they created a collaborative Google Doc. Everybody would take notes in the collaborative Google Doc. And if she wasn't there that day, she still had resources that she could access and share. The days she was there, she didn't have to feel guilty about using that resource because she contributed to it, right? It was a way to share collaborative knowledge and do some knowledge sharing without having to be co-located. And then the last piece is that really successful learning activities, they incorporate a student's understanding of the things that they need to acquire and to understand and apply the knowledge that they're developing in the course. So this is part of where like gameful learning principles come from, right? Is that good games teach students how, not students, users, right, players, how to move through the game. The more that you do something, the more you learn how to solve a puzzle or navigate an objective. But frequently instructional tools and instructional activities don't explain to a student, they explain to a student maybe content-wise what they need to know, but they tend not to explain to students what they need to know as a learner to be able to complete an activity, right? So we focus on content a lot. We don't focus as much on, I feel like I'm making a broad generalization. In the classrooms that I observed, there was a focus on content, and there wasn't as much of a focus on the process of learning how to become an undergraduate student that students are going through in these classes, right? And that process is fraught, it's challenging, It's not transparent. It's actually particularly opaque to the student. And helping students understand that they're going to have to develop a whole new set of skills around learning and around accomplishing their academic work might address and mitigate some of these issues that we're seeing in large lecture classrooms. Oh, my image isn't showing up there at all. But so some quick things that you could do if you are in one of these classrooms this semester, or if you're thinking about something that you want to do as part of the Foundational Course Initiative, is to think about the ways that you can capitalize on the social networks in your class. And when I say social network, I mean offline, face-to-face human beings interacting. Obviously, those interactions can be technology enhanced, but I'm not envisioning that you would use social networking sites to do this work. Social networking sites might be a medium that students use on their own. And so the one way to do that is to frame the tools in your classroom as having sociable capabilities, right, that students can construct on their own. Students did this work in the research that I did. They figured out how to use the tools that were in the classroom in their study groups. They might have gotten there a little bit quicker if the instructors had given them some direction about how to do that. And then identify resources that allow students to connect around their coursework. When students connect, they're exposed to alternative strategies. The other thing that I think is sort of salient is that timing matters, right? In the classes that I observed, all of the information was given about the class was given at the beginning of the course. But students are responding to performance feedback dynamically, right? There may be 2 or 3 weeks before they actually get performance feedback, and that's the first time that they're reflecting on their study strategies. That might be a good time to intervene and to suggest other study strategies or tools or resources they could use. And then the last piece is that because students have access to the internet, they perceive that they have access to unlimited information, which is true, but students are not yet experts in their topic area. Instructors are experts in their topic area. And so instructors may be better positioned to identify these always-on web-based resources that give good general models of conceptual understanding. So one of the things that I did, because I was sitting in these classes and I hadn't taken a bio or a physics or a chemistry class in like a decade and a half, was I went and looked for other instructors who would put their lecture notes up online, right? And I would read through their lecture notes for the concepts that we were going over in class that I didn't understand, which was pretty much everything. I was reading through the textbooks, I was going to lectures, I still didn't understand a lot of this material. But as an instructor, you might even be better positioned to figure out who's got those resources available online. They're open access, they're always on. You could direct students to them. And then I think reframing the value of the textbook is important, right? In a lot of cases, the students that I talked to had never used the textbook in a class where there wasn't sort of direct feedback from the instructor, right? A lot of them were coming from high schools where their class sizes were much smaller than the courses that they were working in at these institutions. And so how do we even frame textbooks for students? How do we explain their value and their utility and their purpose? I don't know in a lot of the classes that I sat in that instructors ever did that, right? Textbooks were just part of the invisible fabric of the course. They were something you had to do, but I don't know that students understood what role they played in their learning beyond exposing them to material that would then be reinforced in the classroom, right? So instructors can kind of be actively centered in these classrooms. You want to engage students by thinking about the ecosystem of resources that they're using, their social environments, and then in particular, using your expert knowledge to direct students to resources when and how they matter, and exposing students to different ways that they could use these resources beyond what they would naturally do.